It is 9:30 here, at least on my time zone. So let's go ahead and get started. A very warm welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're dialing in today. My name is Holger Lenz. I am the DSpace Program Coordinator, and I'm here with my colleague Tim Donohue, the DSpace Technical Lead, and we're excited to host a webinar today about DSpace 9, a Q&A session. So we're going to get started with a few housekeeping items. If you would like to listen to this webinar in Spanish, there's a live translation that you can access. On the bottom of your screen, there is a interpretation bar or interpretation logo rather icon there that you'll see in the Zoom taskbar that you can click on and switch your language from English to Spanish. You also have probably seen the Google Doc with the option to add questions. That was posted along with the invitation to register for this webinar. That Google Doc is accessible via the URL that you see here, but it's now been closed, so it's in view only. So if you have any additional questions that you would like to ask us that come up maybe during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature that is available here in Zoom. You see that also. There's that icon here in your Zoom taskbar on the bottom. So please use the Q&A feature instead of this Google Doc. And then the recording and the slides will be made available after the webinar. So just wanted to inform you about that as well. And I also wanted to mention that in that Google Doc, we will answer all the questions that are in the Google Doc right now. So you, of course, will answer them in this webinar, but you'll also have a written version of the answers later on in that Google Doc itself. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So what can you expect today? We're going to spend about 10 minutes talking about DSpace and the global community. Then we'll spend about 20 minutes discussing or presenting the highlights and an overview of DSpace 9.x. And it's .x because it includes not just 9.0, but also maintenance release for DSpace version 9. And then we'll have the biggest chunk of our webinar today will allow for questions and answers, which will be about 30 minutes. So I probably don't have to talk much about DSpace. I'm assuming most of you, if not all of you, know what DSpace is, the most widely adopted repository around the world. It's not just a software. It's a global community of volunteers, of users, and we are very proud of our community and of the efforts that everyone is making. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Here's a brief overview of the latest numbers. We have a little over 3,300 installations registered on our DSpace registry. If you haven't registered your instance, or if you'd like to update your instance, please visit the link that is on the bottom of the page here or of the slide here. To do that, we have, sorry, just one moment, we have 119 member institutions now, and I'll talk a little bit more about membership as well in over 120 countries. Moving on, thank you. This is a still from a video that was recently made. If you haven't seen the video, I would like to encourage you to watch it because it is a video about the DSpace community and especially about how you fit into the DSpace community. Some of you that are here today may be DSpace users. Some of you may be developers. Some of you may be administrators at your institution. But at some level or another, you are most likely involved in the community. And there's a lot of different moving parts in the DSpace community. I won't talk a lot about this slide today simply because of time. But please take a look at this video and see how you fit in. It might give you a better understanding of how you fit into the community and how you can contribute in maybe other ways to that DSpace community. Here are some ways how you can get engaged and participate. We have some events listed here in 2025, 2024, just to give you a little bit of a taste what happens in the DSpace community. We have several national user group meetings. For example, here listed the Swiss user group meeting that we had in June this year. In May, we had the Polish user group meeting. In March, we had the German user group meeting. We, of course, also had open repositories with a number of DSpace presentations. We have release announcements. So this gives you a little bit of an overview of the different events. If you would like to look at all the events that are happening in the DSpace community, on the bottom left, you see there's a link where it says dspace.org/events. That's part of our website. If you go there, this will give you an overview of the events that are happening in and around DSpace and the community, for you to be able to follow these events, join these events, and get an overview of what's going on. Of course, one of the things that we always talk about in connection with DSpace is membership. If your institution is not yet a DSpace member, please consider whether it's possible for you to join membership. Membership is a way to support DSpace financially. As you know, DSpace is an open source program. Therefore, we do not gain financially by the use of DSpace. Membership is a way to give back to the program financially and support, and also lead the global community, because the institutions that are members, then depending on the tier that they're in, have a right to be part of DSpace governance, which sets the strategic direction of the DSpace program. And of course, we have different membership levels. We're starting at supporter all the way up to platinum, as you can see here. So every contribution to DSpace helps. So please consider whether that's something that's possible for you. If that's something that's not possible, we also have a one-time contribution option through the DSpace Development Fund, which is usually geared towards a certain goal from 2023 to 2025. The funds in the development fund have been used to promote accessibility audits and remediation. So there's been a lot of accessibility work done on DSpace. We had our first accessibility conformance report just released this year, and we continue to work on accessibility improvements in DSpace through the development fund. So thank you to all of you who are DSpace members, to all of you who have contributed to the development fund to support DSpace that way. We thank you very much. I also wanted to briefly mention the DSpace service providers. As you may know, service providers are companies that host DSpace, customize, maintain. In case you choose not to self-host DSpace, they can do that for you. We have 3 different levels of service providers: platinum, gold, and silver, and that depends on the contribution level that they give to DSpace. We currently have 4 platinum service providers. 3 of those are certified: For Science, Admire, the Library Code, and PCG Academia. We have 4 gold providers, and we now have 5 silver providers. So that number has been growing in the last year, which is nice to see, and we appreciate also very much the contributions from our service providers. Okay, that's my part. I will now hand it off to my colleague, Tim Donohue, for the DSpace 9 technical overview.
Thanks a lot, Holger. So I'm going to go through an overview of the DSpace 9 release, which came out back in late May. We did have a similar talk at the Open Repositories Conference, but I'll give you an updated version of that talk. We'll also talk a little bit about what's coming next for DSpace, and a little bit about the current discussions around a potential merger with DSpace Chris. But we'll start with the DSpace 9 overview. And let me get my paging working here. There we go. So to start out with, I want to give you a couple statistics on how big this release is and how much involvement from the community there's been. DSpace 9 was very similar in size to DSpace 8, a little bit bigger, but it had a lot more code cleanup and actually fewer features than the 8 release. But both of these releases were very small compared to the large effort that went into DSpace 7. But what I'm most excited about is on the right-hand side here, the number of code contributors that we're getting in each of these major releases has stayed quite consistent, and we're averaging about 87 people per release. And that's just wonderful to see that we have that much involvement in DSpace these days. And for those who have been around for a while, in the DSpace world. Before DSpace 7, we never hit much above 70 in terms of per major release. It was usually more in the 50s or 60s. So it's great to see numbers way up in the 80s and 90s now in terms of individuals who have given code back to DSpace itself. And before I get into the priorities for DSpace 9, I do want to have a brief interlude here around the DSpace Chris merger discussions, because those did impact the planning for DSpace 9. And in fact, they came out of the DSpace 9 planning process. So while the DSpace 9 planning team was working on our priorities for the release, we started to realize that many of the feature requests that we were hearing from the community overlapped heavily with existing DSpace Chris features. So this is what really kicked off those discussions about, do we need to talk about a potential merger? We brought that to governance, and out of governance came that intent to investigate merger document in October of last year. That's all I'm going to say about it right now, but I will touch back on this near the end of my section of the talk and talk about where we currently sit. But right now it's worth noting that these impacted the priorities that we set for the DSpace 9 release. And in fact, because of that, the priorities were much more streamlined than in past releases. So first and foremost, we wanted to make sure we were not adding new features to DSpace that could potentially conflict with a merger if we decided to go with a merger. And that is really quite straightforward. We didn't want to make that merger any harder than it would already be. So we're looking for features that would not cause issues with a potential merger. And then we did a lot of code cleanup, performance improvements. And as Holger mentioned, we've been doing ongoing accessibility improvements and remediation there for some time, but even more of those came into DSpace 9. So some of the things that came into each of these categories are listed below here, but I'm going to go through some of them and give very brief screenshot demos of some of those bigger features in the DSpace 9 release. So one of the biggest features in 9 was new integrations with openalex.org. These were all based on existing features that existed in DSpace 7 or 8, but this gives you a screenshot view of how OpenAlex is now pulled into the import process. So you can now import content from OpenAlex via title, author ID, or DOI. It works the same as all the other import mechanisms where you can search for something through OpenAlex, get a list of search results from OpenAlex, and then click that import button, which would pull metadata down from OpenAlex and allow you to start a new submission into DSpace based on that metadata out of the OpenAlex system. So that's pretty straightforward in terms of an integration. We have many other systems that already do that same sort of import process. But another thing we added with OpenAlex specifically is the ability to integrate into the publication claim feature. The publication claim feature first came about in DSpace 8. So this is not a new feature, but we've now also added OpenAlex as one of the sources for publication claim. So if you're not familiar with publication claim, it's a way for DSpace administrators to load suggested publications into DSpace, which might match with one of the researcher profiles within your system. And so when a researcher then logs in and manages their profile, they may see a little notification like what's highlighted here in orange that says we found 14 publications in OpenAlex that might be related to your profile. That allows the researcher then to click and review those suggestions and get a list of suggestions of things they could import from OpenAlex if they are something that they had written. So if it is something they've written, they might click that approve and import button and start off an import from OpenAlex of that information. If it's not related to them, they could ignore it altogether. And there's also a button there to see the evidence as to why the system thinks this might be them or something they've written. So this already existed before with the OpenAir system, but now that integration is extended to also support OpenAlex. Another major feature in DSpace 9 is Matomo analytics support. So if you're not familiar with Matomo, it's a GDPR compliant Google Analytics alternative. So it works similar to Google Analytics, and the integration to DSpace is similar to Google Analytics, but it just allows you a different way to capture information about what's going on in your system. And so this screenshot is from Matomo itself, and it just gives you a snapshot of what sort of information you can capture out of DSpace in Matomo. You can get a basic user profile about individual users who are browsing or using your system. You can see what pages and searches they're running, and also what files they've downloaded. So ORCID authentication was also enhanced in DSpace 9. So this has existed for some time in DSpace, but it's now enhanced in a way that allows it easier to link your ORCID account with your DSpace account if you already have one. So now when you click on that login button in DSpace to log in through ORCID and go to your ORCID sign-in screen, there's a new screen that'll pop up the first time you try this. And you'll get information about, you'll see the information's pulled down from ORCID that ORCID is passing off to DSpace, but it also gives you the opportunity to connect that ORCID account with an existing DSpace user account if you already have one. You could click that connect to an existing user button, log in through your DSpace account, and the two become connected, so you can use either one in the system, or you can provide an email address. DSpace always needs an email address to allow you to authenticate. If ORCID doesn't provide that for us, if it's private or set with privileges that DSpace cannot access it, then you can provide one here and get a verification link allowing you to use your ORCID account within your DSpace system. So this is just an enhanced workflow for how to connect your accounts between both ORCID and DSpace and allow you to log in more seamlessly with your ORCID account. In terms of authentication, DSpace also added SAML2 authentication support via a new plugin, and that just allows DSpace to support any SAML identity provider, like one of the ones listed here on the left. When it's enabled, it would appear as a new login option in your drop-down screen, and obviously you can change the text there, so you can have it say login through Azure or OneLogin or whatever you want it to say, whatever system you might be using for your SAML authentication. Another feature that was enhanced with DSpace 9 is the request to copy feature. So this has existed for a very long time within DSpace. And in the past, it's always worked in a way that allows users to request a copy of, say, an embargoed file within DSpace. They can request, can I have an early copy of this, even though it's under embargo? If the user looking at that request approves it, then normally that file would be sent to the user via an email attachment. So you get your request back with an email attachment. You get access to the file via that email attachment. But now in DSpace 9, we have support for sending a secure expiring link instead of that email attachment. So if you have larger files in your DSpace and you still want to allow people to request access to them, even if they're under embargo, then you can use this feature to send them a link that auto expires after a given time period. And you can customize that expiration based on each request. So this screenshot on the right shows granting a request. So if you actually want to approve the request and send them a link to the file, you'll get a preview of what that link will look like for them. And it's a unique link for that request, and you can set an expiration period to only allow them access to that item for a specific period of time. Also in DSpace 9, we've added a new panel to the health area of DSpace. So this health area was added in DSpace 7, and it gives you basic information about how your DSpace system is working, and if there's anything that you may want to be concerned about or anything that might not be working. There's now a new section here added in DSpace 9 called the Search Engine Optimization area, or SEO. And it does a basic validation of your search engine optimization configuration based on the best practices that we have for DSpace. So this is very useful for making sure your DSpace system is indexed by things like Google Scholar or just normal Google or any other search engine. And so by default, it's really just checking for three main things. It's making sure your sitemaps are enabled. You got a robots.txt that points to your sitemaps, and you have server-side rendering turned on because that's very important for some crawlers. So if everything looks good, you'll see a green check box and you'll see OKs for everything, just like here in this screenshot. But if something's wrong in your system, you might see a red X and some description next to one of those three checks that tells you what the problem is and how you need to correct it. So that will give you some better advice on how to make sure your system is being optimized for search engine access. Another major new feature in DSpace 9 is support for geospatial browsing and searching. So this first screenshot has the browsing feature, where optionally you can turn on browse by geolocation, which lets you browse the items in your DSpace based on geospatial data that is embedded within them. So if items don't have geospatial data, they will not appear in this browse. But if you have a good chunk of items that do have that geospatial data, this can be a very useful browse option to enable to allow your users to browse things based on locations across the globe. There's also support for geospatial search. So optionally, you can turn on the geospatial search map view in your search results. So when a user performs a search, they can flip over to this map view and see that same geospatial data of their search results mapped on a map, allowing them to zoom in and select, excuse me, and select individual points as necessary. And they can click on an individual point to get down to an exact item, or they can click on a link in the search results to get to that item as well. And at the item level, then, the geospatial data is also embedded in the item display, where you'll see a related places if that item has geospatial data, including a map of where that location is that this item describes. That's just a few of the features in DSpace 9. As I said, it was not quite as many features as DSpace 8. There are a couple more that I'm not going to go through here today to give time for questions, including support for Apache JClouds and some accessibility settings that are added. All the new features are listed in the release notes, so I'd recommend looking at that if you haven't looked at it already. There was also a large number of performance improvements, accessibility improvements, and a large number of bug fixes as well. But the best place to go would be that release notes if you want even more information about any of the things that I've talked about here. And so before we move on to some of the other topics here, I wanted to give a few quick upgrade tips. And this is mostly just answering questions that I hear all the time after every major release. It's very common questions. It may not be ones that you have, but there are probably a few people in here that have these sorts of questions since I do hear them frequently after each release. So first, can you upgrade from any prior version? The answer is always yes for DSpace. You can move your data between versions as seamlessly as possible in terms of metadata and files, and you can jump over releases. So you could go straight from 7 to 9. You could even go straight from DSpace 1 if somebody had a DSpace 1 out there, all the way to DSpace 9. But the big catch there is that you do need to make sure your user interface is updated, and that means that you need to take a close eye to the release notes, and especially look at the breaking changes for any release you might be jumping over, because there might be changes there you need to be aware of during your upgrade process to make sure that any customizations you've made to the user interface have been brought forward to be compatible with DSpace 9. And in terms of the breaking changes, that is the key thing that you need to be aware of before upgrading. Look at that breaking changes section of the release notes. This documents the major changes that have occurred between DSpace 8 and 9. And these are the things we think might impact your upgrade. They may not necessarily all impact you, but they are things that are larger changes that could have an impact when you upgrade. The same breaking changes section also existed in the DSpace 8 release, describing the main differences between 7 and 8. So it's worth looking at those and any of the DSpace release notes whenever you're doing any sort of upgrade. But for DSpace 9, I did want to highlight a couple of the breaking changes here. I'm not going to go through these in great detail because some of these get really, really technical, but I just want you to be aware of them, and you can go to the release notes for more information as necessary. First, we've migrated from using yarn to NPM for the user interface, and this is really a simplification. So you no longer need to install another dependency named yarn to install the user interface. Instead, you can just use NPM, which comes with Node.js. We've also upgraded Angular 18, which has some migrations that are required for that, but it is an automated process that you can follow in our release notes. There's upgrading to Bootstrap 5 as well at the user interface level, and we have some documentation to help you out there in the release notes as well. On the back end, we've updated to Solar 9, so you'll need to migrate from Solar 8 to Solar 9. And again, I'd recommend looking at the release notes for some tips on that as well. And finally, there's some improved control over server-side rendering, that has been added to DSpace 9 that you'll just want to be aware of, and the details on that are in the release notes. I do also want to note, if you're one that learns in a more visual fashion, there was a workshop on this topic at Open Repositories, and the link is in the slide deck here. And as Holger mentioned, you will get access to the slide deck right after this whole webinar. If you want to go to that link in the slide deck to the workshop slides, there are more visual representations of these breaking changes along with some tips that were presented at that workshop. So if you want more visual content, that's where I would start at, and then go back to that release notes page to review that as well. A few more notes. There are two ways to upgrade with DSpace. You can do the traditional upgrade process where you install the new version of DSpace on top of the old one. That's an option for you, but there is also the option to migrate your content over. And this is where you might install a fresh copy of the brand new release and then migrate your content and your configurations into that fresh copy. Either of these two options will work for any upgrade for DSpace. So it's really a matter of choosing which one that works best for you. There's no preference given. You'll end up with the same result either way, but I do like to stress there is two ways to do this upgrade. So you might want to get familiar with both and see which one works better for your particular scenario. And it might be different based on minor releases versus major releases. So there may be scenarios where you might want to use either one. And this is a question I get all the time. Are configurable entities required yet? And no, they're still not required for DSpace 9, but we are building more and more features on configurable entities. So if any of the features listed here are important to you, then you will need to enable configurable entities. And I also want to keep stressing that even if configurable entities are enabled, you're still able to use traditional items. So items can sit alongside configurable entities, and you can use both together as necessary. But you do not need to upgrade to, or update to configurable entities unless you need these features. And last but not least, in terms of the tips, if you need help, we have a great support guide that guides you to the best place to ask for help, whether it's mailing lists or Slack, or even going to service providers if you need paid help. If you're running into weird issues along the way, I highly recommend using the troubleshooting guide to find the error message that's occurring. There's usually always some sort of detailed error message, either at the user interface level or at the backend logs. Use that troubleshooting guide to find that detailed error message. And if you've just upgraded or installed, the common installation issues section of our installation guide is a great place to go to get very quick answers, because that will give a detailed error message you might find during your installation process, and then the solutions that we're aware of to solve that problem. So you might not even need to ask for help if you look at that common installation issues area to see if the error you're hitting is listed there. So what's next for DSpace? So that all came out in May. I did want to note in the somewhat recent past, as Holger mentioned, we did have some security bug fix releases. So just if you didn't see these on the mailing list announced in mid-July, be aware that we did find some vulnerabilities in the simple archive format import process that can be that can affect both the user interface and the command line. So we released a number of bug fix releases, not only for 9, but also for 8 and 7. I'm not going to go through these vulnerabilities here today, but there was a email sent about that to the mailing list, and you can also find the links with more details about each one of them in this slide after our session today. But beyond that, we are planning for the 10.0 release tentatively in May of next year. We're still working on the final priorities. As of right now, as of today, the priorities are more generic like they were for DSpace 9, because we're working on the final decision for that DSpace Chris merger discussion. but that should be announced very soon. In the meantime, we have been doing some development on DSpace 10, but we're just making sure to not touch on things that could impact that merger decision. In terms of other bug fix releases, there is expected to be a 9.2, an 8.3, and a 7.6.6. When they will come out is still to be determined. My best guess is maybe later this year or very early next year. But one thing I did want to note is that we only support the last 3 major releases. So keep in mind, if you're still on DSpace 7, you'll want to consider planning an upgrade soon, because as soon as DSpace 10 comes out, DSpace 7 will no longer be under support, because at that point in time, our support will shift to DSpace 8, 9, and 10, because we support those last 3 major releases. So do keep that in mind. That does give you a little bit of a runway to get to your upgrade in. DSpace 10, as I mentioned, is tentatively in May of next year. So you have at least about 9 months or so to try and get your upgrade in process. But do kind of keep that in mind going forward. So what about that DSpace Chris potential merger? I'm going to give a very brief update on that, and then we'll open things up for questions here. I mentioned already why we were considering this merger a little bit, because that strong overlap in features, but I also did want to stress that we had been seeing some duplicated effort for some time, and that's grown more and more since DSpace 7, that we've had features that are ported between DSpace and DSpace Chris, which is managing 2 systems in parallel. DSpace Chris is managed by the Force Science team, while DSpace is a broader community project. Force Science does have community members working with them, but there are some people who work on both, and they were doing a lot of duplicative work. And so we're trying to get that duplication cut down. And as I mentioned, there's also a lot of use case overlap that is coming about, both in the DSpace 9 planning, as well as just since the introduction of configurable entities. Because the reality is that DSpace Chris is really similar these days to DSpace, with entities enabled, plus a lot of extra entity-related features layered on top. So it's like a DSpace with a bunch of entity-related features on top of it. So that's the main reasons why we're considering this. As of today, we still do have these 2 planning groups that are having discussions and coming towards final analysis and all that to be passed on to our governance groups. The strategy planning group has shared their strategic vision document or not earlier this month. I forget, it's September. A couple weeks ago, though, in August, they shared their strategic vision document. So you can go take a look at that on the mailing list, and the links are here in this slide. The technical planning group shared an analysis of the differences between DSpace and DSpace Chris from a feature perspective on the wiki. So that's available for you to look at, and they're now also looking towards building out a possible roadmap for how could this merger actually occur if we approve that process. But I do want to keep stressing that no merger decision has been made as of today. We're getting closer and closer, but we're not there yet. But I do want to share that there is some general consensus about what a merger might look like if we can get to, if it does occur, if we approve it and everything goes forward. This is the idea of what it could look like to us all. The idea would be a unified product that is still named DSpace. We'd be enhancing and not replacing current DSpace, retaining the features of both these systems as much as possible, and allowing a way for sites to decide, do you want your site to behave more like current DSpace behaves, like in DSpace 9? Do you want it to behave more like DSpace Chris behaves? Or do you want it somewhere in between where you can mix and match some of the features that are of most interest to you? So this is the higher level goal that we're all looking towards. But again, none of this is finalized, and a decision is not made as of today. We're just getting closer to that process. In terms of the timeline, this is where things began. As I mentioned, they started back in August of last year, where we started even discussion of DSpace 9. As of now, we're really to that point where we're trying to conclude our work as best as we can before the end of this year, in October to December. The very earliest that conclusion would occur is sometime in October, but it could be as late as December. And we're looking to give our recommendations back to governance so that they can make a decision on behalf of the community. But I did want to also stress there isn't a way that you can give input into this process. We've shared this already on mailing lists as well as at open repositories and at other places. but we do have a feedback form, an anonymous feedback form where you can give your feedback about this merger process. The link is here in the slide deck, and this QR code will also bring you there as well. This gives feedback directly to our governance group as well as those planning groups about what you think about it, what questions you might have about this potential merger. And I also did want to note that we're working on a webinar around this potential merger, a discussion webinar, hopefully later this month in September, and it'll be a Q&A style similar to this one, where you'll be able to ask more questions in that webinar as well in a live fashion, and we can answer some of the common questions we've heard already. So if that's all of interest to you, or if you want to give feedback into the process, please do consider filling out this form if you haven't already, and also keep an eye out for an announcement regarding that webinar coming up. And that's it for me. At this point in time, we're ready to open up the floor to your questions, whether the live questions or the ones in our document. As promised, you have a link to the slide deck right here in the bottom of this slide, and maybe Holger can copy that in for me if you get a chance, Holger, into the chat so you have it there. The QR code here also brings you right to the slide deck as well. So the slide deck is immediately available to you right now. But let's go ahead and open things up for questions. So Holger, I could
Yep.
use your help here in
Yep.
combing through what we have.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you for taking us through the highlights of DSpace 9. And I put 3 links here in the chat. The first one is to the tally form, that feedback form that Tim just mentioned. The second one is the link to the presentation. And the third one is the link to that Google Doc that we're now going to reference, where there are some questions in here. We'll start with that, and then we'll move on to the questions that have been posted in the Q&A chat here in Zoom. So the first question that we'll consider from the Google Doc is, can we retrieve virtual data from related record of a related record? For example, publication A is related to the author B, and the author B is related to the org unit C. Can we get the org unit name from the BC relation and show it on the A publication? Is there any method except storing both 2 relations on the publication A?
Yep. And I was prepared for this one because this was one of the few questions that I saw as of yesterday. So I can show a demo of this. I'm not going to be able to go through how it is done today because that is a little bit too complex to go through here in a webinar. But I want to show an example of how you can get related information across essentially 2 relationships. And the example I'm going to show is in the compound journals area, which is on our Sandbox site. So I'm on the Sandbox site here, sandbox.dspace.org. I'm in the Compound Journals community, and this will show you how information is gathered across 2 relationships. If I go down into a journal entity is related down to journal volume. So this is one relationship. So we're going from journal down to a journal volume. At the journal volume level, we can then jump down to the journal issue level. So that's a second relationship. But what I want to highlight on the journal issue level is we have information here that comes all the way from that top relationship, the journal itself, in the metadata. So this is showing gathering information across 2 relationships. This is not metadata that is actually stored on the journal issue, and it's not on the journal volume. It's coming from the journal itself. So the issue is able to pull metadata out of that journal that it's related to and display it on its page. So you're getting information related to the title and the ISSN of that journal, which is only on that journal object. So that's a brief overview of how it can be seen. I'm not going to go into the details here today of how to do that, but I would highly recommend looking at how that journal relationship works and do something similar if you need a similar scenario in your DSpace site. So that's sort of the quick answer there. So
Thank
we can
you.
move on to the
Yep.
next. Yep.
And I was just alerted that I apparently shared the link to the Google Doc twice instead of sharing the link to the presentation. So let me go ahead and put that link here in the chat. Hopefully this will work now. And thank you, Kent, for highlighting that and pointing it out. Second question is how to extend the filter by date to include a calendar so that the user can search from a specific date range.
Okay, so that is, I'm going to pull my window back over. I'm looking at the Sandbox site again. I'm just going to do an empty search on the Sandbox site. Sounds like they're asking about a date range search here, which right now we do not, excuse me, we do not have a calendar in this date range search. Instead, we have this sort of slide bar along with ranges. So it is possible to use one of the ranges here to click and narrow down, and then also use the slide bar here to go to a specific range, and modify that. You can also edit the dates within these fields to do that. We do not have at this point in time a support for a calendar pop-up. Um, and off the top of my head, I don't know how complex that would be, but that's something you could request as an improvement into the issue ticketing system. But I'd also stress that DSpace is built entirely by developers. So the only people who actually are on staff for DSpace are myself and Holger, at least semi full-time. We have other people who help out in part-time ways, but we don't have any developers on staff. So all the development work comes out of volunteerism. So if you are interested in helping to build that into DSpace, I'd recommend seeing if you can give it back. And if you want more advice on how to do it, you could ask on either the mailing list or Slack if anybody's done this before. I'm not sure off the top of my head if anybody's implemented a calendar at that level. So that's my quick answer for that one.
All right. Third question. Can you demonstrate integration with Google Analytics or Matomo?
I think for that one, I'm going to rely on I showed it in the slide deck what that looks like. I don't have Matomo running locally. I wasn't prepared for this to show off, but essentially, and in the slide deck I showed earlier a screenshot of Matomo and information Matomo is able to gather. You don't actually see Matomo when it's in your DSpace site. You don't see it visibly there. It runs sort of in the background in the JavaScript, just like Google Analytics, so it doesn't add anything visually to your site. But as you saw in my screenshot, there was information it can gather. So if you look at the documentation, there are more screenshots from the Matomo perspective that I would reference you to in the documentation. And I can add a link to the documentation after this session today.
Thank you. How to enable item metrics on item pages, like number of citations, number of views, and downloads.
Okay, that is something that I'm going to go. I'm on the Sandbox site. Let's go to just a page, an item page. Uh, right now, we do not have metrics embedded on the item page, but we do have basic metrics in this statistics link at the top. This statistics link is actually dynamic in that it changes based on what page you're on, and some people don't always realize that. So if I click on statistics here, I'm actually getting statistics for the item itself, including views, visits per month, and some of the file downloads that are occurring from that item. So that's one way to visualize those statistics. In terms of embedding them on the item, I can't provide exact advice on that today, but I do want to note that this is something that does have overlap with that DSpace Chris merger discussion. DSpace Chris has more embedded statistical information that they built in to their system. And if this merger is to occur, we would sort of inherit a lot of that into DSpace. So it may be coming if that merger goes forward. And that includes on the item level, also community collection level, even the site level. There's just more enhanced statistics. It's still the same statistical engine that DSpace uses, that DSpace Chris is also using. They just have more ways to visualize the data. So that's one thing I would look towards as well, but you're also welcome to ask for some advice on mailing lists and Slack if there's specific things you want to embed within your DSpace view. So I'm going to leave it at that for today, though.
All right, thank you. Question number 5. In DSpace 9, I want to implement localization so that every document is uploaded in both Swahili and English. When a user switches to English, only the English version of the document should be displayed. And when the user switches to Swahili, only the Swahili version should be shown. How can I customize the submission form and display logic in DSpace 9 to achieve this?
Yeah, this makes me smile a little bit, this question, just because I think what we're seeing here is the proof that we had seen in the DSpace 9 planning process that there's a large overlap in the questions we're seeing for DSpace for things that already exist in DSpace Chris. So DSpace Chris, as I mentioned, does have a lot of enhancements around entities, but they do have a couple things that are not entity specific. One of them was the enhanced statistic views that I mentioned, which we would love to have back into DSpace. This is actually another one. This idea of being able to view an item page and have it appear in different languages um, based on what you're selecting in the user interface. There's more ability to do that at the DSpace Chris layer than there is in DSpace. So we can provide some basic advice maybe on mailing lists or Slack on this one. And I know there's others who've asked questions around this, but I did want to stress as well that there is enhanced internationalization support at the item level within DSpace Chris that if we can find a way to bring this merger together, we'd inherit some of that and can improve upon it as well to enhance this process.
All right, thanks. Question number 6, which is the last question from the Google Doc. Then we'll move on to the Q&A questions here in Zoom. It says, to implement a medium-term solution, what would be the most convenient method to deposit items from external applications into DSpace 9? For example, from OJS or another client. Previously, SwordApp v2 or version 2 was used, but it is unclear whether Sword version 2 is still viable, or if it would be better to wait for version 3 or implement a deposit via the REST API.
Um, to be honest, well, Sword is still supported in DSpace 9. We don't have any plans to get rid of support for Sword 2, and we also still have support for Sword 1. We do not yet have support for Sword 3 because there's been uh, from what I've seen, there's been less pickup of that from other systems. So that does not exist in DSpace yet, because most people who are using Sword are still using 2 or sometimes even 1. So you can use Sword 2. That there's no plan to remove that anytime soon. You also are welcome to use our REST API. That is another way to get things into the system. And in some ways, it might even be easier than Sword 2, depending on what you're trying to do to get the data in. So the REST API is also available. I would honestly say at this point in time, it kind of might depend on your use case and what system you're trying to integrate and what you're most comfortable with. If you're already doing things with Sword 2, you can stick with that. There's no plans to remove that anytime soon. And if there were, we'd notify anybody way beforehand because there are a lot of systems that still integrate with DSpace via Sword 2. But the REST API is also a good choice as well. So I'd probably go with one of those two, either Sword 2 or the REST API, depending on what your needs are and which one works better for your use case.
All right, thank you. Moving on to the questions here in our Q&A chat. First question is for the request a copy via secure link. How large is a large file? Is there a size limit?
It's configurable, so you can set the size limit yourself. There is a default configuration for that request a copy via secure link, and I'm not going to be able to remember that off the top of my head. I don't remember what it is, but you can configure it yourself. So if you're finding that you want even smaller files to be sent via that secure link, you can make that a small value on your end. It's really up to you what that size limit is.
Okay, thanks. Pauline is asking, migration has meant losing legacy statistics, downloads importantly before 9. Does this still happen migrating to 9?
We have a process in our documentation for migrating statistics forward through any release. So you shouldn't have even lost it in DSpace 7 or DSpace 8. There's a process for moving those statistics forward. Um, but it's possible I'm not understanding the full context of this question. But but I would reference the documentation, which does have that statistical migration process. In some cases, you do have to export the statistics out of Solar and import them back into Solar in order to migrate them. With DSpace 9, even though we're upgrading to Solar 9, I don't believe that's required, and I think that's in the release notes. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but I believe it's not required to do that migration out of Solar and back into Solar because Solar 9 and 8 are pretty similar in nature. But I can correct myself afterwards in the doc. We can copy these questions into the doc if I find something different. But I'm pretty sure it should be pretty straightforward with DSpace 9.
Okay. And then Gonzalo was wondering, what is the best practice for migrating the user interface? I've already customized in DSpace 8.0 to version 9.1.
I would look at the release notes for DSpace 9, specifically around, there's two main things you'll need to do. You're going to need to ensure your changes are updated to Angular, the latest version of Angular, Angular 18, but there's an automated script that'll do that for you, and that's documented within the release notes of DSpace 9. And then the other thing is to look if you made customizations at the theme sort of layer in terms of, or not theme, the CSS sort of layer is what I mean. You'll want to make sure that those customizations are updated to Bootstrap 5 because we're now in Bootstrap 5 with DSpace 9, and there's tips on that as well in the release notes. And also, as I mentioned, there was a presentation at Open Repositories in the developer workshop that talked about both those in a little bit more detail. So I would look in both those areas for the hints and tips on how to do that upgrade or update. And if you have any other questions, feel free to ask on mailing lists or on Slack, and we can help with more specific issues if you hit anything else.
Okay, another question from Gonzalo is from a DSpace 6.3 without entities. How can I easily migrate authors, for example, to entities in DSpace 9.1?
Authors are not easy to migrate to entities because in DSpace 6, authors were literally just a text string, essentially. So you don't have enough information to turn them into an entity. So that's not a very seamless process at this point in time to migrate to an author page. You'd almost need to just create the author entity um, manually because all you'd have coming forward was that author name anyways, and then link it up to the author publications. There are other entities are more easy to migrate. I know you didn't ask this, but if you're migrating from traditional items to publications, that's a really easy migration because publications are essentially the same as traditional items except for one metadata field that makes them a publication. But with authors, we don't have a seamless process for this at this point in time other than creating them more manually. But at the point when we start to require entities, I would expect we'd have some better advice for this to help people along. So that's all I have for today on that, though.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question about the merger. Will there be an opportunity at an upcoming webinar for folks to ask for science staff about DSpace Chris? They are the experts on DSpace Chris.
That's a good question. I think I'd probably forward this on to we can talk about that in the strategy planning group is the one that's going to be organizing that webinar. So I think that's something that Holger and I can bring to that strategy working group to see if we want to add that to that upcoming webinar or have other opportunities. I will note though that there is resources that Force Science has already created around DSpace Chris, including a large number of video demos which we can make sure get linked into the notes of this webinar into that Google Doc. If you haven't seen those yet, that gives a really good overview of how DSpace Chris is different than DSpace, and they have these video demos you can watch on your own time. So that's a good thing to look at if you haven't seen it. But in terms of asking questions, we can see if we can make Force Science staff available. That's something Holger and I can bring to the folks doing the webinar.
Thank you. And I've just put the link to that webinar that's on the website, on the DSpace website here in the chat. Now, the webinar is not yet open for registration, so keep that in mind. The registration link will be forthcoming, but this gives you the information here about the time and the date. And Andrea Bolini from Force Science will be there at that webinar, but we'll incorporate your question, as Tim said, into more of our discussions in the strategy group. And now I lost my Q&A window. It has disappeared. Where did it go? There it is. Okay. Next question, how to migrate from DSpace 6 to DSpace 9 or latest version?
That is that I'd follow the, let me go back to this migrate versus upgrade question here. Um, I would follow the migration process in that case. If you're jumping over several versions, it's often easiest to do this migration process, which would be install a fresh copy of DSpace 9, and then migrate your data out of your DSpace 6 version into the DSpace 9 version. And this page will walk you through that process. There's a number of sites that use this process regularly, and they've helped us update that page and keep it up to date. So I would follow this process when you're doing a larger jump over major versions. This is often the easier route to take. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Another question is it possible to manage content pages such as help, about, or news from the UI instead of adding them as Angular components and having to go through the dev test deploy cycle for every text change?
At this point in time, unfortunately, that is not yet possible, but that is something that we've been discussing in developer meetings recently around, is there a way for us to better modularize the DSpace user interface to allow for um, easier changes of this sort? So I don't have great news on that necessarily from DSpace, but I also do want to note this is another area that slightly overlaps with that DSpace Chris merger discussion. They do have basic ways to modify like the news at the user interface level in DSpace Chris. Um, I don't recall off the top of my head on that in terms of help or about pages, but that's another thing that again, if the merger goes forward, we would inherit some of that code to allow us to build on top of that and enhance DSpace to support that. But at this point in time, we do not have that in DSpace 9. So it's
All right.
coming hopefully in the future. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. We have time for a few more questions. We're approaching our 1 hour mark here, but we've got time for just a couple more questions. Will the Virginity framework be moved with entities in the next versions, or will the linking one entity to another continue through relationships?
I don't know what that is asking, to be honest. The virginity framework, that's got to be a typo or an autocomplete fail because I've never heard of that. Um, will in the next release, next version, we're linking one entity to another, continue through relationships. I think I need more information. We link entities via relationships, and that's planned to continue, but I don't know the rest of the context of that question, so we might
Oh,
just skip it.
I just saw
Oh,
the, it
authority.
was,
I see. Authority
yes,
framework. It's the
yes,
next one. That's what.
yeah.
Okay. That is under discussion. That's part of the DSpace Chris and DSpace merger discussion. So the main difference between DSpace Chris and DSpace is in that relationships model. DSpace Chris uses the authority framework to do that linkage, and DSpace uses the database. That's still under discussion, and we would announce more around that in the merger discussions itself. But I would anticipate we wouldn't change anything too drastically for either DSpace or DSpace Chris if that merger goes forward, at least in the near term. We'd want to plan for a better way to do things in the future. So I don't have too much to say about that yet.
Okay, thank you. Next question is it possible in this version to assign group access to a specific collection that has already been created?
To assign group access to a specific collection that has already been created. Um, collections, I feel like there's context here that I'm missing because collections can be assigned groups easily. You can have groups within groups. So if you wanted to have a collection that had an admin group and have it embed another group that's already created, that would be possible as well. But that's been possible for a long time. So I feel like I'm missing some of the context here around what the problem is, because this seems like something that is already possible to me in DSpace 7 and DSpace 8. So I'd recommend maybe asking this on mailing lists or Slack, or get back to us with more details here.
Thank you. And I think we have time for just one more question. The questions that we're not getting to, we're going to take these questions, put them in the Google Doc, and then answer them in the Google Doc itself so that you'll have your answers there as well. Um, our final question that we'll answer live is, should we anticipate a yearly new release moving forward, or will this slow down after DSpace 10?
I would anticipate a yearly major release each year. And we're planning on trying to keep a yearly release process, and we will support the last three major releases. So that gives you time to decide when to upgrade. You don't have to upgrade to every major version. You can jump over versions if you want, but there will more than likely be a yearly release. And part of the reason for that is because the platforms we build on rapidly change. Both Java these days as well as Angular rapidly change. And if we don't do a yearly release, then it will be difficult for us to support the last three major releases. So it's really kind of a matter of how rapid software moves and how many security issues need to be patched over time, and improvements and all that sort of stuff has kind of forced us into this path of a yearly release. But we'd welcome feedback on it nonetheless, but I would anticipate that will be the way forward from here on out.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Apologies that we did not get to everyone's questions. The hour has flown by, but we're at the hour mark. So we're gonna stop answering questions live here. Like I said, we'll take the questions, we'll put them in the Google Doc and add them there. And if you have any other questions, further questions that will come up about DSpace 9 or about any other versions, of course, please feel free to put those into the community groups, the Google groups, the tech group with a Slack that we have, and we'll be happy to answer those as well. So wanted to thank all of you for joining today. Thank you, Tim, for presenting the tech part of things of DSpace 9. It was good to see everyone, and we'll see you next time. Hope everyone has a great day, and take care.
And thank you all, and thank you, Holger, as well.